questions, and go ahead. Yeah.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Hello, everybody. You're at a webinar this evening being coordinated by the Columbia County Library Association and the Columbia County chapter of the Citizens Climate Lobby. And tonight we have Karen Frischkopf with us from the Citizens Climate Lobby, and she's going to introduce our two presenters.
We are very, very happy to welcome former State Senator Jen Metzger from Ulster County, who actually had a hand in crafting New York State's Climate Leadership Community Protection Act. She remains very active in the climate movement and in particular, New Yorkers for Clean Power. Peter Savio, who is also a Citizens Climate Lobbyist from Schoharie, has a background working for the New York State Energy Research Development Association, does consulting with renewable energy, and he will provide a little bit of input regarding the particular role of what's known as carbon pricing. What that is, he'll explain a little bit, and we'll see how it can affect the prospects, the fulfillment of New York State's Climate Action Plan. So with that, I invite you, Jen Metzger, to lead us off.
Great, thank you so much, Karen. First of all, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining tonight to learn about how New York is responding to the climate crisis, what the plans are to meet the goals of our ambitious law, and importantly, how you can participate in this process and give some input into it. It was hard work to get the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act passed, but it's nothing compared to what it will take to implement it. This is like a very important moment in this process. And we'll be hearing about the implementation plan. But I wanted to note that New York passed one of, probably the most ambitious climate law in the country. And now that we're moving forward in developing the plan to meet these ambitious goals, the fossil fuel industry has woken up to this and has launched a very well-funded campaign in New York to try to undermine public support for the law, for the law and efforts to meet those goals. It's being led by the American Petroleum Institute, which some of you more climate old timers like myself may know, played a really big role in the early 80s in funding a huge campaign to sow seeds of doubt about the science behind climate change. And, because of the industry's efforts really set us back, helped to set us back decades in responding to it. The science is very clear. Unfortunately, we're all experiencing, and the globe is experiencing the impacts of it. Now they're casting doubt on the solutions to addressing it. So we'll talk about that in a bit. But because of this, it's very important. There's a lot of misinformation, and it's so important for people to have accurate information about about how we can shift to a clean energy economy in New York, address the climate crisis, and also create many other benefits for our state and for New Yorkers. So I'm going to share my screen. I've got some slides to share. Let's see, it always takes me half a sec to get this set up. So there we go. This picture was actually taken on what's called the $1 Million Staircase in the Capitol, when it was touch and go whether we were going to pass the law, because the governor at the time, he was acting as if he wasn't sure he was going to sign it, but thankfully he did, and we now have our climate law. So what we're going to do this evening is I'm going to give you an overview of the scoping plan process, kind of like the who, the how, and the what it is. I'm also going to cover key recommendations in for the four major emissions sectors in New York that collectively account for 85% of climate damaging greenhouse gas emissions in New York: buildings, transportation, the electricity sector, and waste. And then we'll talk about how you can participate in the process. And then I will turn it over to Peter. I just want to give you kind of a quick look at what's in this 330-page plan. We are not going through all of the sections, but I just want you to get a sense for how much ground it covers. It's a very comprehensive. It covers all of the emissions sectors, plus really important, kind of cross-cutting issues like, our local government policies, the role of local governments, land use planning, adaptation and resilience, of course, very important. Carbon pricing strategies, Peter's going to touch on at the end, but it's very comprehensive. So what is the draft scoping plan? So the scoping plan is essentially the implementation plan to reach the goals of New York's Climate Act. These include reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030 below 1990 levels. So that's just 8 years from now, achieving net zero emissions by 2050. And what we mean by net zero, we are required to reduce actual emissions by 85% of greenhouse gases, and the other 15% has to be sequestered. And should be sequestered, in our natural and working lands. So land use planning is very important, protecting our forests and the like. The law also requires that we generate 70% of our electricity from renewable resources by 2030 and reach an entirely fossil fuel-free electricity system by 2040. And finally, and importantly, our law is very much about ensuring that the transition to a clean energy economy is a just and equitable transition that leaves nobody behind, that prioritizes disadvantaged communities and dedicates 35% of the benefits of clean energy investments to disadvantaged communities with the goal of 40%. This scoping plan is extremely important because it's going to shape state legislation, regulation, and the decision-making of every state agency and department for years to come. The law requires that the plan be updated every 5 years, but this is really what every state government entity will turn to in decision-making, including decisions about spending. So just to give you sort of a sense of the process, the scoping plan was developed by a 22-member Climate Action Council that was established under the climate law. And it includes all of the heads of the relevant state departments and agencies, as well as 10 appointed members that include primarily a mix of environmental and climate justice advocates, industry representatives, and scientists. The council's work was informed by the recommendations of 7 advisory panels with expertise in the different areas, as well as a climate justice working group and a just transition working group, which were both created by the climate law. The climate justice working group, I want to mention, is also responsible for developing the criteria to identify disadvantaged communities. As I mentioned, one of the law requires that we dedicate 35 to 40% of the benefits of clean energy investments to disadvantaged communities. So we have to know, who are these disadvantaged communities? And they have been at work in a parallel process to the scoping plan, developing criteria. And there's actually, it's maybe a little confusing, but it's a separate process with a separate public comment period. We can discuss if anyone has questions at the end, but they have for public comment, they've released for public comment 45 draft criteria. And I'll just show you, this is what the map of New York looks like with their criteria applied. The purple census tracts are the census tracts that have been identified as disadvantaged. In Columbia County, I believe there were 4 census tracts that were developed. 2 of those were in Hudson. I can share the link so that you can see this information. So this pie chart graph was taken from the scoping plan. It reflects the most up-to-date greenhouse gas emissions inventory for New York. I want to just say something briefly about how the inventory was done. Our law required certain things about the inventory that makes it far more comprehensive than other states. It has to include upstream emissions, even when they're out of state emissions. So for instance, like when the gas in your stove in your kitchen, you're not looking at just the emissions when from its use in your home, the emissions of fracking that gas in Pennsylvania and piping it through a series of pipelines and distribution network, and the leaks that are inherent in that pipeline system. All of those emissions are taken into account. So it's a very comprehensive system, and it all accounting of greenhouse gas emissions. And it also it's on a 20-year rather than a 100-year time frame to really take into account the incredibly potent impacts of methane emissions on climate change. So in New York, the leading sector of emissions are our buildings, which we'll talk about in a bit, and followed by transportation, which is a close second. And electricity is in third place, but it has outsized importance because it is the linchpin, as we'll discuss, of the clean energy transition, which is really about electrifying everything. So meeting our climate goals is going to require transformational changes in every sector. This is a snapshot of the kinds of changes that we will have to make. This is according to the integration analysis, which was conducted for the scoping plan to look at how far recommendations would get us and the emissions reductions we need to make. And that analysis, found that across, kind of all the scenarios they looked at, by 2030, to reach our emissions reduction goals, we're going to need to electrify 1 to 2 million homes with heat pumps, replace 3 million gas vehicles on the road with EVs or zero emissions vehicles. I think there are some 50, maybe 55,000 on the road right now. So we have a ways to go. We have to divert 100% of our organic waste from landfills. That's a very big source of methane emissions. By 2040, fossil fuel power plants, which account for 43% of our electricity generation in New York, must be fully retired and replaced by renewable resources. It will probably be primarily wind and solar, although we have other renewable resources as well, together with battery storage. So the analysis for the scoping plan found that the cost of inaction was far higher than the cost of policies to meet our climate goals when you take into account avoided health costs from fossil fuel pollution and avoided damages from climate change. The net cost of meeting, and it was about, they found that it would be it would cost us about $90 billion more to do nothing by 2050. The net costs of meeting our climate goals are quite small relative to the size of New York's economy. And that's because we would be replacing most of the equipment and goods that we need to replace at the end of their useful life. So it's about making the right choices for those replacements when it's time and doing the work we need to do to replace them. So that's not to say that there are not upfront costs, because there are upfront costs, and there is a gap in this plan about how, we're going to pay for them, and there are different strategies to pay for them. But this is, this is a very important question, and it's something that you can weigh in on in public comments. The health impacts or the health benefits for New Yorkers alone would be tremendous in achieving our goals, just because the co-pollutants, the other pollutants from fossil fuels, like fine particulates, are just so damaging to the health of our communities, particularly in disadvantaged communities where a lot of fossil fuel infrastructure is sited. But the scoping plan, as they mentioned, in all scenarios, air quality improvements can avoid tens of thousands of premature deaths, thousands of non-fatal heart attacks, thousands of other hospitalizations, thousands of asthma-related emergency room visits, and hundreds of thousands of lost work days. And it's estimated that between 50 and 120 billion in savings would result between 2020 and 2050 due to air quality improvements and the impacts, the positive impacts it would have on health alone. There are also enormous jobs benefits to shifting to a clean energy economy and meeting our goals. The Just Transition Working Group, which I had mentioned, was required to do a jobs analysis, and found that statewide we would see a net, if we stay on track in meeting our emissions goals, we will see a statewide net gain of nearly 190,000 jobs by 2030, reaching 268,000 jobs by 2050. I mean, that is an unprecedented large number of jobs. The largest wage increase is in the middle wage positions. So, bucking the trend of a declining middle class in the last 50 years. Over half of these new jobs are in buildings related professions, because a lot of the changes that have to be made and improvements are in the building sector, and those are labor intensive. Those are labor intensive industries. The job study found that the ratio of jobs created to jobs displaced would be about 10 to 1, which is pretty dramatic. But this, is not to minimize the jobs that will be displaced. And, it's incredibly important that New York, that we prioritize right now the job training and putting the programs in place now to both support workers, expand their skill sets in fossil fuel related industries, to make the transition into clean energy industries more seamless, and just have the programs in place to support them beginning now in that transition. And also the training programs, workforce development in place to train all of the new workers that we'll need to make this shift to a clean energy economy possible. Okay, so we're going to highlight some recommendations now. I'm going to start with buildings. As I mentioned, buildings are the biggest source of emissions. About a third of our emissions are from our buildings. And eliminating those emissions is also really the toughest nut to crack, because we have over 6.2 million buildings in New York. Over 5 million of those are single family homes. And much of them need to be electrified and made more efficient. One set of recommendations focuses on strengthening building codes and standards. including passing the Advanced Building Codes and Appliance Standards Act, which is actually a piece of legislation that, well, a different version of it just passed the Senate and the Assembly, so they have to be reconciled and signed into law. But the plan, the draft scoping plan, actually says that this has to be passed in this legislation, in this legislative session, even before the scoping plan is finalized, just because of the timing that we have to reach our emissions reduction targets. Another key recommendation of the scoping plan is all electric requirements for construction of new buildings beginning in 2024 for most residential buildings, and then extended to new construction for commercial buildings and residential buildings over 4 stories beginning in 2027. This is technically feasible, totally doable, cost effective, and new construction is really the low-hanging fruit. There has been legislation proposed that would start that process for 2024. Again, the scoping plan is very clear. The draft scoping plan, if we were to meet this time frame, the legislation has to be passed in this session, of which state legislative session. So for existing buildings, the scoping plan recommends that by 2030, zero emission standards should be in place for end of life replacement of fossil fuel heating and hot water equipment, with a 2035 date for large multifamily and commercial properties. Also by 2035, there will be zero emission standards for new appliances like dryers and stoves. It's recommended that they be put in place as well. Just to be clear, these standards wouldn't require that you replace a working system. This is for new equipment purchases only at the end of life of existing equipment. So as we transition to efficient electric-based technologies, we have to be transitioning off of utility gas, which is what most New Yorkers use. This is a complex undertaking because it's tied to a wider utility gas system. So the shift has to be carefully coordinated and cannot increase the burden on low and moderate income households. The scoping plan recommends that a couple of things happen as soon as possible. Critically, the laws that govern utility and gas service have to be made consistent with our climate law. So right now, utilities, anyone who wants a new gas service, who wants to be added to the gas system, the utilities are obligated under public service law to hook them up to natural gas rather than encouraging, for instance, installation of heat pumps. This drives expansion of the gas system when we need to be retracting that system. So we need to change that law and make it consistent with our climate law. Also, the utilities have to be directed to stop promoting gas and start ramping up marketing and incentives for heat pumps and energy efficiency improvements. I was actually very pleased that the state budget this year just passed a new $5,000 geothermal tax credit, which will bring down the cost of those systems. They're more expensive than air source heat pumps. We can talk about that later. I'm not going to get into the specific technologies at the moment, but we need more incentives like that, more support. And finally, and importantly, the planning has to be done to transition to clean heating and cooling systems in a way that maintains affordable, safe, and reliable utility service. There was a bill introduced by Senator Liz Krueger called the Gas Transition and Energy Affordability Act in the state legislature that would provide the kind of comprehensive approach needed. And it would be great to have the approach in that bill integrated into our scoping plan. So no false solutions. It's very important that that in public comments, we're supporting the scoping plan's focus on efficient electrification to eliminate emissions and to steer clear of the false solutions being promoted by the fossil fuel industry and utilities, like renewable natural gas and hydrogen for buildings, which is a way to just continue to perpetuate use of the gas system infrastructure, in perpetuity. And finally and critically, it is the scoping plan has to include a firm commitment to the $1 billion annually that NYSERDA estimates is needed to assist low and moderate income households in making the improvements necessary to their homes. This is essential to achieving a just and equitable clean energy transition. Okay, moving on to transportation. So as I mentioned, transportation accounts for 28% of our greenhouse gas emissions. A big part of the solution here again is to electrify. Though it's not all of the solution by any means. We also have to expand public transportation as an option for folks, particularly outside of the major cities, and also make our communities more walkable and bikeable. So we don't have to, then this again comes back to what local governments can do in land use planning and need to be supported in that. Thanks to legislation that was passed and signed into law in December, all sales of new cars in New York will be zero emissions beginning in 2035. We have a gap though, because as I mentioned earlier, the analysis that was done for the scoping plan estimates that we need to increase EVs on the road to about 3 million by 2030. And EVs are more expensive than gas-powered cars. So the only way to make that happen is through policies that affect pricing. I know Peter's going to talk about a more economy-wide proposal in a little while, but the scoping plan also, specifically for this recommends a fee bait on car purchases. This would essentially be an additional fee on the purchase of fossil cars to pay for incentives for EVs. And so it would just properly incentivize the right choices by consumers and make it more affordable. Another beneficial policy would be to eliminate the sales tax on electric vehicles. And finally, we have to accelerate the build out of a fast charger network across the state. And also fix utility rates to encourage EV adoption and off-peak charging. We also, as I mentioned, need to expand public transportation. This, in my opinion, did not get enough attention in the scoping plan, and I think it would be very valuable to share in public comments your community's public transportation needs and priorities. There's also a whole set of recommendations around development that supports non-motorized transportation at the community level as well. I do want to mention that New Yorkers for Clean Power, the organization I policy advise, is hosting a teach-in specifically on the transportation recommendations of the scoping plan, and we'll do, if you're interested in a deeper dive into transportation, I'll share the link to that teach-in. It's on May 24th. And now we'll move on to electricity. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about the need to electrify buildings and transportation, but to be truly zero emissions, we need the grid to be powered by clean, renewable energy. We need to get to 100%, and we're currently at about 27% statewide, and most of that is legacy hydro, like Niagara Falls. Only a very small percentage is wind and solar. And in fact, with the closure of Indian Point, our reliance on fossil gas has actually increased a little bit. So it accounts for about 43%. We have a lot of work to do, but The good news is that we already have a clean energy standard in place. The Public Service Commission has revised that standard to meet our 2030 renewable target under the Climate Act. This standard requires utilities and energy supply companies to procure increasing amounts of renewable energy over time until we reach our targets. So it's a mandated standard that utilities have to meet. Of course, these renewables have to get built, physically built, and there are a number of scoping plan recommendations that focus precisely on that. We'll also need to greatly expand storage capacity, both to meet short duration needs, like when everyone's using power at home, after work, after school, and after the sun goes down, as well as long duration storage or some resource that can be called upon in a bitter cold week when we're all using our heat pumps and they're running at full tilt and the sun isn't shining as much. So storage, it plays a very important role, and there are important recommendations in the plan to meet the storage goals. Oops, I didn't mean to skip that, sorry. To meet our emissions goals, the scoping plan really needs to come firmly down on the side of prohibiting permitting of new fossil fuel infrastructure. And this is something that I think is important to emphasize in public comments. It's also important, I think, to support the plan's call for the DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation, to develop regulations to ensure a continual decline in emissions from power plants until we reach zero emissions in 2040. As recommended by the Climate Justice Working Group, the first plants that should close should be up, and we're talking about fossil fuel fired generation, should be those that disproportionately harm disadvantaged communities. There also has to be protections in place for all communities affected by plant closure, including ensuring support for workforce transition, funding for localities to offset local loss of local property tax revenue from the plant closure, and an enforceable requirement that the plant owner is responsible for site remediation. Now, those sites are actually prime sites for battery storage because they're already sited to interconnect to the grid, which would reduce those interconnection costs and would ensure continued revenue to the communities, as well as jobs. So that's one possible option. So it's important. There are numerous recommendations in the scoping plan about expanding renewable energy in the state, and I can only touch on a few of these. We only have so much time, but one very important recommendation is to set annual targets on a megawatt basis for state permitting of renewables, so that we're getting enough projects built to meet demand, to meet our needs. The same goes for battery storage. The plan recommends expanding the clean energy standard, or else creating a separate storage standard, so that we can make sure that we're staying on track and expanding our capacity. Other important recommendations in the scoping plan focus on supporting high value renewable projects that contribute to equity, resiliency, and smart land use, like expanding agrivoltaics, which I think is a hugely exciting opportunity. I've been in a working group advising NYSERDA on this, about, we really need to be co-locating agricultural activities with solar and wind. The utilities also have to be required to better support renewables on the local grid. They're not nearly as supportive as they need to be. They need to expand hosting capacity so that we can interconnect projects on our homes, our schools, our landfills more easily to the grid, and speed up the process of reviewing applications to connect to the grid. There are a lot of recommendations in the plan to better support local communities as partners in the clean energy transition. I was in local government for many years, so this is before I was in the state Senate. So these recommendations are near and dear to me. Local governments and local communities are such important partners, and will need assistance, for instance, mapping tools to help them better plan for where they would like to site renewables within their communities, resources for streamlining the permitting process, resources for model zoning and the like. Benefits should also be expanded to communities that host large-scale projects. We're seeing a lot of pushback in New York and nationally against the siting of renewable projects. But if we're going to transition to a clean renewable grid, we don't have a choice. We have to be careful in our siting of them, but the answer cannot be no to the citing it everywhere. We won't be able to reach our goals. So we have to work together, and we have to do it in a way that everyone, is participating. Which brings me to a very important point that does not get enough attention in the scoping plan. Reaching our climate goals depends on public support and engagement. And also on inspiring young people to pursue clean energy careers to support that transition. So, it's important that the scoping plan direct NYSERDA to support a well-funded statewide public education and information campaign. We also need climate change curricula in K-12 to begin to, this really has to be part of our understanding, everyone's broad understanding, and we need that knowledge base, and so that we can participate as full citizens in this transition. Work also has to begin really like yesterday to recruit, train, and skill up the necessary workforce. Unless New York begins to develop that workforce now, trained workers won't exist to fill the jobs when we need them. So this is something that I think is very important to amplify in the scoping plan in public comments. Okay, so the last sector I'm going to touch on today is waste, which accounts for 12% of the state's emissions. Although I just want to point out that's only end use emissions. It doesn't take into account the huge life cycle costs of products and packaging. And actually, there was just a report released not too long ago by Beyond Plastics that showed that the greenhouse gas emissions from the US plastics industry is on track to surpass the coal industry by 2030. So reducing that use of plastics, plastic packaging is extremely important. We don't have time to go through all of these recommendations, but we'll share these slides with you so you can look at them at your leisure. But reducing organic waste is really critical. As I mentioned, we have to divert it entirely from landfills and incinerators. Incinerators are huge problems, very polluting in New York, and also contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. We need to do that by 2030. And edible waste, we should be using foods as edible waste to feed the 1.5 million food insecure people in New York. It shouldn't be ending up in a landfill. And inedible organic waste can be composted and used to improve soil health, which is so good for the climate. It builds the soils and helps sequester carbon in the soils. And it's so good for agricultural productivity. So we can be making much better use of this waste. And there are lots of great recommendations in the plan to get us there. The scoping plan makes a number of recommendations around reducing waste, which is critical, including enacting extended producer responsibility programs, By request only legislation. So for instance, you're not just automatically handed a straw with that soda, you're asked whether you really need one. Requiring minimum levels of recycled content in products, and really contributing to a more circular kind of economy. We have to reduce plastics. This is, the plastic waste is a huge problem. All right, I know I covered a lot of ground in those four areas. Before I turn it over to Peter, I just wanted to, talk with you briefly about how important, first of all, how to provide written comments, but also just how important it is that you provide public comments, right? Because it's not a one size fits all here in New York State. Our communities have different concerns, have different circumstances, and it's just important that your voice and your perspective is heard. And it's also important, as I said from the outset, there's this huge misinformation campaign being pushed by the fossil fuel industry to kind of fight this plan and these recommendations. So expressing support for moving in this direction is very important. The public comment period runs through June 10th. The link at the I've actually, for New Yorkers for Clean Power, developed a public comment toolkit just to make it a little easier for people. It has a lot of resources, and the link to that toolkit is at the top. This slide also includes the link to where you can either go kind of submit your comments directly into a portal on the NYSERDA website. At that link, you're limited to 2,000 characters. So if you have more to say, you can just email your comments to scopingplan@nyserda.ny.gov. I've put together some sort of sector-specific public comment guides in buildings, electricity, and waste. The links to those are there, but they're also all in the toolkit, online toolkit at the link above. It's just, you shouldn't feel like you have to respond to every recommendation by any means. It's really speaking to the the broad approach that we've discussed, accelerated kind of electrification, backed by a clean, policies that move us toward a clean, renewable grid. But speak to those issues that are important to you, and that that you really want to weigh in on. Let's see. And whoops, I didn't mean to go there. Well, I'll stop sharing now, and I'll turn it over to Peter, but I just want to say, I skipped the timeline slide, but want to mention that, as I said, June 10th is the public comment deadline. The Climate Action Council is going to take all of these public comments, review them, make revisions to their draft plan, and then they're required to issue their final plan by December 31st of this year. They have to present it to the legislature and to the governor. And I can tell you, I've already legislators heard them say, like, wait, I want to wait and see what's in the scoping plan before I consider this bill. So everything that's in there is going to be used as a reference. So it's incredibly important that you weigh in. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Jen. And before we switch it over to you, I'm just going to ask Jen if you can put a link to the slides in the chat, or some of those links, because people are concerned about being able to reach them.
Oh, sure. Okay. Well, yeah, there were a few things I talked about. So
I think particularly the slides and the your last slide on some of the links,
right,
to get to those.
The link to the slides, I'm going to have to, it's a PDF.
Okay.
So I'm going to have to send you a link. I'm going to have to get it into a place where I can send you a link, or else you can send the PDF around. But I will, while Peter is talking,
yep,
I'm going to put a bunch of links that I mentioned with that.
And we are recording this, and the recordings will be on the library's websites. They will be doing that. And someone else in the chat says that Zoom captures and attendance log, and we'll be able to do that. We will be able to follow up with people. Okay, thank you. Peter?
Great. Thank you very much, Jen. Another solid summary of a 330-page plan that goes even deeper and wider than Jen just did, and she distills it in a way that's clear and accessible for all of us. I would just highlight really what the final point she was making, and she mentioned it several times. That is, please engage, please comment. Your comments should reflect your priorities, your values, what's important in your community and to your family. There's no reason to think you have to be an energy wonk or a policy wonk. These materials are there. And to tell you the truth, the summary in the scoping plan is very readable. So you can also jump into that. I'm here to just spend a couple of minutes talking to you about a price on carbon and why that's valuable, why that's needed in New York. And CCL, the Citizens Climate Lobby, works on it on a national and international basis, but let's just focus here in New York tonight. Clearly, this is a highly ambitious plan. This plan is, as Jen stated, probably the most ambitious in the country. It's organized on a sector basis. And when we recognize that it's on a sector basis and covers hundreds of strategies, I think it's only realistic to expect that it'll be challenging for the legislature to adopt the hundreds of strategies, the regulators to adopt the hundreds of strategies, particularly on the timeline, in the time frame that has been recommended. That leaves us short of goal, and we know how important the goals are. So in that context, a price on greenhouse gases can help to amplify all of the strategies and drive a clear price signal that could start very low in the state, rise very gradually, and begin to influence decarbonization across the board. So that's the overall framework for how we're thinking about this. Amplify the other strategies so that we meet these very, very crucial goals. A couple of other reasons why we think a price on greenhouse gases is so important. As Jen mentioned, the law requires that the benefits flow at least 35%, ideally 40% to disadvantaged communities. However, in order to achieve and deliver on those benefits, there needs to be funding. A price on greenhouse gas emissions can provide the funding to satisfy that objective in the plan to address equity and address justice. It can also provide funding so that we protect the 3/5 of our state citizens that are the most economically disadvantaged. That is, that the lowest 3 quintiles in income. So we think it's really important that a price on carbon satisfies not only the decarbonization, but it provides funding to deliver on equity and justice and to make sure that people are made whole. We can also deliver a price on carbon on a state level beginning on a sector basis. We need to acknowledge that we already have a price on carbon in the electricity sector here in New York. By having a price on carbon in the electricity sector that does get passed on to consumers, that presents an obstacle, a barrier. It slows down the adoption of electric vehicles. It slows down the adoption of building electrification, whether we're talking about heat pumps for heating or for hot water. These are highly cost-effective solutions if the price on carbon applies to natural gas and fossil fuels as well as electricity. But if it applies to electricity, it distorts the playing field. So those are the three reasons we really want to achieve goal. And it's unclear that the wide range of strategies will be adopted and adopted on time. Two, the revenue is needed in order to deliver on the goals and deliver on equity and justice. And three, we need to rebalance and correct this distortion where the electric sector has a price on carbon and other sectors, natural gas in particular, fossil gas in particular, does not. So I'll leave it there because we don't have a lot of time. Really appreciate your time and attention. Really urge that people please comment, please jump in, engage. Karen.
Hi, Peter. So tell us about how do you do a price on carbon? What does that mean? Who gets charged what?
Well, fundamentally, a price on carbon is going to require legislation. There are several pieces of legislation that have been proposed in New York State over the years. Most of them start at a much higher price, and most of them would apply more immediately to the transportation sector. So it will require legislation, and the legislation would define exactly what those prices are, Karen. So our argument is that people please consider the economy-wide solutions that are identified in Chapter 17 of the scoping plan. That identifies and clearly describes different options to put a price on carbon. And we're simply saying that the price on carbon that provides a cashback to the bottom 3 quintiles is a core principle, and addresses equity and justice is a core principle.
Okay, so it could be like a polluter tax or something that we've heard about, where the producers, processors end up paying some fee for every ton of carbon dioxide or other.
It would be a fee. That's the way it works in Reggie. It would be an allowance, a fee that is paid on the tons of greenhouse gases in the electric sector. We need to equalize that in the other sectors. We think it makes sense to start reasonably low and go after gas first. But thank you.
Okay,
Please jump
thank
in.
you.
Please engage. Please comment.
I saw,
Sorry, you want to read the chat button? Go ahead.
oh, sorry. Yeah, I just saw a couple of questions. One was about this, is the storage goal really only 15 megawatts? So that is for, so it's 15 megawatts to buy. This is what NYS, the New York Independent System Operator, says is necessary to reach by 20, I think it was by the 2040 goal. But we will need 20 megawatts by 2050, what I recall. Oh, and you asked if it was megawatts or gigawatts. It's megawatts, but I can double check for that. And then there was another question about the difference between propane and natural gas. Propane is a byproduct of the production of oil or natural gas. And whereas and we don't actually, the scoping plan has changed the term, has made a conscious choice to not refer to natural gas as natural gas, but as fossil gas, which is really what it is. It's fossil gas, but that is, extracted directly from the earth through fracking primarily. So yeah, so one's a byproduct of extracting and producing oil and fossil gas, and the other is the actual fossil gas extracted from the earth.
Thanks. There's some more questions here. One is, do partnerships exist already between government and citizens who are eager to combat climate change, and government officials who care about actually implementing the laws they pass? Where each can tell the other what they need to be effective?
Well, I think that at the local level, there are lots of opportunities for that. When I chaired my town's environmental commission for many years, and our climate smart community committee, and that really was about bringing together interested citizens and working with local government officials to take the actions that we need to take. I think every town is different. Every municipality, there are actually a lot of pretty active climate smart communities in New York State, in some regions more than others. But I would say get involved at the local level. And if there are people working on this already, you should start them working on it because it's really important. You can make a real difference. I got grants, to install electric vehicle charging infrastructure in my town, and in a few different locations. And it's great for business, by the way. I put one right in the municipal lot in our downtown business district. And I don't know if you drive EVs, but there's people look at this PlugShare, this app, and you can, when you install a charging station, I put in our theater is here, there are hiking trails over here, all of these things. You can basically promote your downtown, and then people will come and charge in your town and go take advantage of all of the amenities. So, but you can, these are the kinds of things you can do at the local level that are really meaningful. Passing stronger the stretch energy code, that's critical. It's a model state level overlay of the existing energy code, which it improves energy efficiency in residential buildings by almost 20%. So for new buildings or major renovations, which is great for the people that are going to occupy those buildings. Their costs are going to be much lower living in those buildings, and it will have healthier indoor air quality as well. So these are all things you can do at the local level that are really important.
Thanks. There's one last question here. I'm sorry, there's one last question. It says, what's happening with taxation on renewables? A recent court decision has changed this. Where do you think it's going?
A recent court decision, I'm not familiar with it. I'm sorry, I wish I was, but are you talking, at what level was, a little more context? Where was that court? I haven't heard of anything in New York.
It looks like this question was by Dan.
Maybe with a little more information, but I haven't heard of anything that, I haven't heard of anything, any recent changes.
Yeah.
Well, I think, am I right, Toby, that we're needing to wrap up because you have the call has to end?
It is 7:01.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I just want to thank you so much, Senator Metzger and Peter and you, Toby, for sharing all this information for us. Yes, there will be a recording available in a couple of days. I think it's great that you ended on the value of working at the local level. I think probably everybody on this call may be from a different town. Most of them, I would bet, have a climate smart task force already at work that they can join. And if not, as you said, get it going. So
yeah, absolutely.
Anybody on the call who's interested in jumping over to a meeting that will start in 37.5 seconds, probably, the Columbia County chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby is going to be starting and then going on just till 7:30 or a little after. If anybody's interested, please just check the link in the chat and join us.
Remember to save your chat, very important.
Yes, okay.
Thank you,
Take
Jen.
care, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Good night.
Good night.